The second part of the long-awaited Final Fantasy VII Remake trilogy is finally here. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth releases today, an expansive RPG that's perhaps this year's most significant PS5 console exclusive. We took a quick look at the first few hours of the game in a piece last week, but now it's time to crack open the full game and see what's under the hood. So how does the Unreal Engine 4 powered Rebirth take advantage of PS5 hardware? What are the enhancements over Remake, and are there any unexpected visual follies along the way? Let's start with what Final Fantasy VII Rebirth does well. To keep spoilers to a minimum, I'm restricting my footage to roughly the first 40% of the game, and I've avoided any key plot details for this piece. Rebirth's cutscenes are where its most striking visuals reside. These are bombastic, beautifully directed sequences that provide stunning views of near CGI-level character models in a mix of expository and action scenes. The level of visual quality achieved here is very impressive, and the cinematics are often outstanding. That was true of 2020's Final Fantasy VII Remake as well. So what's changed? Character designs have been tweaked quite a bit for these sequences, with higher grade and subtly more realistic modeling. Take a look at Barrett, for instance. He looks older, with more angular cheekbones and smaller eyes. His skin is more detailed, with better defined specular highlights, and his beard and hair stubble is more clearly separated. On first impression, you wouldn't necessarily notice these changes, but a close look reveals that the model has been remade for this entry. Cloud has also been retooled. His card-based hair, for instance, is less angular and exhibits more fine detail, with less dithering and breakup. It also exhibits more obvious light occlusion and self-shadowing, and appears shinier and less dry than its remake counterpart. The upgraded fidelity of the skin rendering is obvious here as well, with Cloud's skin taking on a more natural tone in a range of conditions. Tifa has been changed as well, with a pointed, less round face and greater polygonal density on her arms. Aerith looks different too, with cleaner looking smoother hair, though her facial proportions remain about the same as before. The cutscene lighting has also been improved, often going for cinematic 3-point lighting setups that bring the characters into sharper relief against backgrounds. We see effective indirect lighting in these scenes too, with obvious light bounce from reflective surfaces like sand. These upgrades give the cutscenes a more consistently high-quality appearance. Rebirth's cutscenes are some of the most visually captivating sequences I've seen to date in a video game, with fidelity and animation that easily beat a lot of older CGI, like the Advent Children's CG film from 2005. A handful of the game's cutscenes are still presented with offline CGI, however, and these still do offer far higher fidelity than the real-time graphics can achieve, with perfect reflections, great indirect lighting, and beautifully flowing cloth and hair. Rebirth's real-time sequences aren't particularly close, but still look great in their own right. The game's action combat is another high point. These battles are a flurry of GPU-driven particles and smoothly animated combat moves. The camera tends to zoom out a bit more than in Remake, and we often see somewhat larger fights with bigger and more numerous foes. But beyond that, it's broadly similar to the experience we had before. The combat is still a high point though, and the default action mode strikes a good balance between reaction-based real-time combat moves and slow-motion tactics. I think Rebirth very effectively handles its more naturalistic environments as well. The polygonal density and level of ground clutter here is pretty solid, and definitely up to expectations for a current-gen game. There's a lot of nice incidental details in Rebirth's open world segments, which seem to have been partly enabled by the use of the PS5's primitive shader functionality, as the developers have reported. Relative to Remake, we're getting a pretty huge boost in the basic fidelity of these more naturalistic environments. Plus, and perhaps more importantly, Remake doesn't actually have any truly open areas, with the map featuring a more tightly constrained scope. These wide open gameplay spaces are a Rebirth exclusive, and distant detail appears to be made of real geometry, unlike Remake, which often resorted to 2D art. Rebirth cities are also worth commenting on for a moment here. Rebirth has some pretty expansive and dense city environments, with plenty of civilians scurrying about and lots of geometric and texture detail. Remake is quite limited by comparison, again with limited corridor-like towns and cities that feel a little bit artificial. Rebirth effectively takes the Final Fantasy VII Remake formula to work within a more expensive setting, and that's where I think we've seen the most technical progress. The broader scope, plus the improvements to character rendering and cutscenes, are the basic enhancements here. But unfortunately, there are some areas where Rebirth is just treading water relative to its 4-year-old predecessor, and quite a few spots where we've actually taken a step back. Let's move on to Rebirth's most obvious visual flaws. Environmental lighting tends to be a serious pain point here. To be fair, many environments look perfectly fine, including the game's cities, which can exhibit decent pre-calculated lighting, and some of the larger open-world spaces, which look fine while relying more heavily on real-time techniques. Some of the interiors can look quite nice as well, at least when judged from a distance. The problems really emerge when we start examining some of the game's models up close. Here we see complex structures that would demand decent pre-calculated lighting to look good, or some kind of real-time traced lighting. Instead, Rebirth presents these areas almost without any lighting detail at all, or with basic non-shadow casting lights. It often doesn't look great, making the environment look like just a bunch of models jammed together. Larger scale occlusion is also largely absent, as we can see on the flatly lit decks of the ship here. For a big budget current gen game, Rebirth can look a little baffling at times. High fidelity consistent lighting is a cornerstone of current gen tech, and even without ray traced GI, we would expect a better result here. That becomes especially clear if we take a look back at Remake. Remake's baked lighting wasn't always super high fidelity, just look at the low-res pre-calculated shadows here for instance. But it did a pretty good job of simulating global illumination within more constrained spaces, and smaller objects generally looked appropriately grounded and shaded within the world. That's just not the case much of the time in Rebirth, with worse lighting in typical play. There are some other lighting problems too. Rebirth shadows are usually at a very low resolution. There is a high-res shadow cascade at comically close distances to the player camera during gameplay, and the shadow resolution during cutscenes is generally fine, but most shadows during gameplay have a lot of breakup and aliasing. Final Fantasy VII Remake had higher res shadows, especially in its Intergrade iteration, as we're seeing here, which boosted shadow res somewhat for PS5 consoles and PCs. I'm not one to harp on low-res shadows usually, but the quality difference here is pretty profound. It's hard to believe that lowering shadow resolution to this level is worth it, relative to just using a bit more dynamic res in the image. We also see a fair number of quite low-res textures. Now, Remake had a lot of issues with texturing in its PS4 incarnation, but Intergrade mostly solved those issues. For Rebirth though, we do see a lot of low-res 2D art, but not universally. Instead, most of the dodgy texture work comes in the Mount Nibelheim ascent in Chapter 1, which has a lot of textures that need improvement. You will spot the occasional low-res asset from time to time elsewhere, but Chapter 1 has the lion's share of texturing issues for sure. Rebirth also has problems with traversal animations. The environment has a lot of rocky outcroppings and the like for the characters to traverse, and their animations, when presented with an obstacle, look unconvincing. Expect stilted, jerky jumps and bizarre-looking animation when Cloud or another playable character blasts through an obstacle at full speed. Barrett's climbing animations also look rather physically implausible, though I'm not sure how a one-armed person is supposed to make those leaps. Finally, there are a couple other things I wanted to touch on. The water usually looks fine from a distance, though the SSR can be a little annoying as it doesn't have an effective cube map fallback. Water in Rebirth isn't really interactive though, with no geometric or even normal mapped ripples to trail the player. Splashing around does kick up sprites, but the actual water surface remains quite flat looking. And there's no animated collision between the player character and foliage. Cloud simply passes through the foliage here, with zero apparent reaction from the bushes and leaves. This isn't a big issue necessarily, but the first Rebirth trailer did feature foliage collision, which looked like touch bending, as my colleague John noted at the time. In the final game, this is totally absent. Don't get me wrong, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is generally a good-looking game that can look superb in its best moments, but the title has some obvious visual flaws, primarily with lighting, that in some cases make it less appealing than its 4-year-old predecessor. It's a larger and often improved visual experience over that game, but these concessions are annoying. Rebirth offers two visual modes, a graphics mode which targets 30 FPS and a performance mode which targets 60. Underlying visual settings appear to be a match here, so you're getting identical shadows, draw distances, and all the rest of it as far as I can tell. Resolution for the performance mode averages at around 1152p, while the graphics mode is usually at or near 4K, with both modes employing dynamic resolution. That's nothing particularly special, but there is a very odd quirk with the performance mode. The game doesn't upscale to 4K using a typical bicubic or bilinear method, but instead seems to double the pixels using a nearest neighbor technique or something similar, albeit with a slightly soft final resolve. It's pretty blocky and still doesn't look much sharper than more conventional scaling methods. I did try setting the PS5's output resolution to 1440p in the system settings, and the blockiness largely disappeared. It may still be scaling down from that 4K output though, as taking the original 4K output and doing a bilinear scale to 1440p produces a similar enough result. Still, it might be worth considering for those who really can't stand the image resolve in performance mode. Unfortunately, the relatively low resolution in performance mode, likely combined with some low-res post-processing or another visual bugbear to make the game look softer, means that Rebirth is a lot less sharp than Remake when targeting 60 FPS. I thought Remake looked pretty solid with its 1512p typical resolution in performance mode, but Rebirth really doesn't hold up well on a 4K set with the same visual options. I think the performance mode needs some upsampling driven retooling. We don't know what version of Unreal Engine 4 Square Enix was using. If it's using an older release like Remake did, it would predate the adoption of upsampling technologies within Unreal Engine, but something really should be possible here. That would hold especially true if camera-based motion blur was added during gameplay. The graphics mode usually looks clean and sharp on a 4K set, with a pretty crisp appearance in most content, though some edges can seem just a touch soft at times. I did notice a bit of ghosting as well, but it's otherwise a good image resolve. Again, I do wish camera-based motion blur was added. Per object blur is enabled at all times, but the lack of camera-based blur makes the graphics mode look unnecessarily choppy. Interestingly, camera-based blur is also absent in cutscenes, which is a change from Remake. At least the graphics mode does hold a very stable 30 FPS. It's basically a locked 30, with a dropped frame or 16 millisecond frame very occasionally disrupting that 30 FPS line. I spent most of my time playing in this mode, and it does provide a consistent experience in combat, traversal, and cutscenes alike. The 60 FPS targeting performance mode is a little wobblier. It does stick to 60 FPS a healthy majority of the time, but as the game progresses, it does exhibit a tendency to drop frames during battle sequences, where the GPU seems especially taxed. We sometimes get a frame rate readout between 50 and 60 FPS here, mostly during particularly particle-filled moments. Elsewhere, the game is typically a close to locked 60, with just the occasional dropped frame or two in the mix every so often. Nibelheim also exhibited frame rate issues in my testing. As an aside, loading performance in Rebirth is very good, just like it was in Intergrade. Typical loads last around 5 seconds here, which is nice if you're fast traveling or hopping around from save to save for some reason. And there are no loading screens during the game itself, except of course for fast travel. At the moment, I'm inclined to recommend the graphics mode to players on 4K panels, but I'd personally rather play a 1440p class 60 FPS mode if something like that was available. Unfortunately, combining decent image quality with high performance might have to wait for a potential PC release, or perhaps a version for an enhanced PS5 console down the line. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth has some big visual strengths, but some unfortunate visual lows as well. You get beautiful cutscene sequences and a greatly expanded world, but have to tolerate some questionable lighting, low-res textures, and poor image quality in performance mode. It's a curiously uneven visual experience, which I think is put into stark contrast by the last major Final Fantasy title, last year's Final Fantasy XVI. FF16 had great baked lighting, extremely detailed assets, and stunning combat. It essentially solved typical shadow map issues using a novel shadowing technique that allowed for very fine detail and a beautiful variable penumbra effect. Its cutscenes were beautiful as well, showcasing an excellent physically based materials pipeline and super high fidelity characters. Its environments also had very dense geometric detail. Final Fantasy XVI was one of the very best looking games of last year, and I think on the whole it's quite a bit more visually accomplished than Rebirth. And all that was achieved on a custom engine developed around the needs of the title. I wouldn't chalk up all of Rebirth's issues to Unreal Engine 4, but UE4 isn't necessarily the best engine for lighting larger environments. I hope Square Enix will be migrating to more current-gen oriented tech for the final FF7 Remake Trilogy entry, perhaps Epic's Unreal Engine 5, because the visual outcomes here are more mixed than I would have expected. Tech like Lumen would be hugely transformative, I think, if used appropriately. So technically the results just aren't quite up to expectations, even if individual pieces of the game's visual makeup still definitely impress. As a game though, fans of Remake will find a lot to like here. I think its critical acclaim is well deserved, even if the somewhat intrusive minigames were a little annoying. It does a great job reimagining the middle section of the original title, while expanding the action combat that felt so fresh in Remake. I loved Remake, and while this isn't quite as much to my taste, it's certainly a very effective sequel. Rebirth is without a doubt worth a playthrough for Final Fantasy fans, but its visual output is more inconsistent than I'd like. It's still a good looking title, just one that arrives with certain key caveats. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and press the bell for YouTube notifications. Check out the Patreon at digitalfoundry.net for exclusive and early access content. And to get in touch, use social media. Thanks for watching.